The disappointment Maya Thompson stood in line at the gate, with a calm demeanor that masked the anxiety creeping up inside. She had been looking forward to this trip for weeks, and everything had been planned with precision. She had made sure to book her flight early enough to avoid the chaos of last-minute rushes and overbooked flights. The entire week had been stressful, and the idea of spending a few days away from work to recharge felt like the perfect escape. But as she stood there, waiting for the boarding announcement, her eyes flickered to the clock on the wall and then back to the gate agent, who seemed unusually tense. Maya felt a sudden unease wash over her. Something didn't feel right. She had been on enough flights to recognize the subtle signs of an issue building up. At first it seemed like just another ordinary delay, but the more she observed, the more she felt that something was off. The agent was making a few too many glances at the computer screen, and then at the passengers milling around the gate. Finally the announcement came through the voice of the gate agent crackled over the intercom with a tone that was polite, but far too rehearsed for comfort. "Ladies and gentlemen, we regret to inform you that due to an overbooking situation, we are looking for volunteers to take a later flight. We apologize for the inconvenience and will offer compensation for those who are willing to be moved to another flight. Thank you for your understanding." Maya's grip on the armrest tightened and her stomach sank as the words hit her ears. The frustration bubbled up. She had heard the term overbooking before. It was a well-known practice in the airline industry, a tactic used by airlines to maximize profits at the expense of passengers, but Maya had never experienced it firsthand. She had heard the complaints, the murmurs of passengers who had been affected by it, but she had never been one of those unlucky souls who had to suffer through it. But now it seemed like her time had come. As the announcement continued, Maya's gaze drifted across the crowd of passengers standing round the gate, some of them looking round uncertainly, others shifting uncomfortably on their feet. The sense of unease was palpable. Maya could see it in their faces. She could feel it in the air. The agent began calling out for volunteers, and a few passengers raised their hands. One by one they were pulled aside and handed new boarding passes for a later flight. Maya watched them disappear into the distance. With a mixture of annoyance and disbelief, she had made plans. She had a schedule, and this flight was supposed to be the key to her well-deserved break. She wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her. She was about to turn her attention back to the gate when she heard her name called, Maya Thompson. Her stomach dropped at the sound of her name. It was almost as if the universe had singled her out for this nightmare. She hesitated for a moment before stepping forward towards the counter. "Yes?" she asked, her voice calm but laced with a hint of apprehension. That gate agent looked at her with a forced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Miss Thompson, we're in a bit of a bind here. The flight is overbooked, and we need to move some passengers to a later flight. We've already called for volunteers, and unfortunately, it looks like you've been selected for reassignment." Maya's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her mind raced through 1,000 thoughts all at once. She had been carefully watching the boarding process, hoping she would be one of the lucky ones who wouldn't be affected by this mess, but now it seemed like she was the one caught in the middle of it all. Her hands instinctively reached into her pocket, where her phone rested, and she quickly checked her flight details just to make sure she wasn't mistaken. She had done everything right, and now this excuse. "Me," she said, her voice quieter but firm. "I've checked in, I've paid for this flight, and I've done everything by the book. I'm not going to just give up my seat." The gate agent glanced at the screen again, and her fingers tapped nervously on the desk. She clearly wasn't prepared for a confrontation. "I understand, Miss Thompson, but this is just a standard procedure, and we're trying to accommodate all passengers," the agent said quickly, her tone still polite, but no longer carrying the same confidence it had earlier. "If you're willing to volunteer, we can offer compensation for your troubles." Maya shook her head. No, her mind already made up. "I'm not volunteering," she said with finality, her eyes locking onto the agent's. "I've got a schedule to keep, and I'm not about to let you change it for me. I'll take my seat, thank you." The gate agent seemed to hesitate for a moment, as if trying to gauge Maya's seriousness, and then sighed. She looked at her computer again and tapped a few keys before finally handing Maya her boarding pass. "You're in seat 16B. Miss Thompson, please proceed to the gate," the agent said, with a tone that was slightly less polite than before. But Maya didn't care. She was done with the small talk. She wasn't about to let the airline dictate her plans any longer. She had worked too hard to be derailed by something so trivial as overbooking. As she walked down the jet bridge towards the plane, Maya felt a sense of pride swelling within her. She had stood her ground. She wasn't going to let anyone take advantage of her. Her role as a federal aviation inspector had given her a deep understanding of the airline industry, and she knew the rules better than most. She had a right to be on this flight, and she wasn't going to back down now. But as she boarded the plane and made her way to her seat, she began to notice something strange. The cabin was unusually quiet. Passengers sat in their seats with a tense expression on their faces. No one spoke, no one made eye contact. It was as though a cloud of discomfort had settled over the entire flight. Even the flight attendants seemed to be moving in slow motion. Their faces tight and unapproachable. Slid into her seat and buckled her seatbelt. Her mind was racing again. Something didn't feel right. She had experienced her fair share of delays and inconveniences in her career, but this felt different. It wasn't just an overbooked flight. It was as if there was something more at play, something that wasn't immediately obvious, but was brewing. Just beneath the surface, she leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes for a moment, trying to calm herself, but her thoughts kept returning to the situation. Something told her that this wasn't over yet. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something bigger. Then the intercom crackled to life, and the flight attendants began making their usual announcements. But Maya wasn't paying attention to the standard safety instructions. Her mind was focused on one thing, and one thing only. This wasn't going to be as simple as she had hoped. Maya Thompson wasn't just any passenger on this flight. She was an expert in aviation safety and regulations, and something told her that this flight was about to become a lot more complicated than anyone could have imagined. The hum of the engines beneath her seemed to grow louder in her ears, as if echoing the tension that was building inside her. She sat up straighter, her eyes scanning the cabin as the reality of the situation began to sink in. This was no longer just about her getting to her destination. It was about something bigger, something that would require all of her skills and expertise to uncover. She had a feeling that by the time this flight landed, her role as a federal aviation inspector would become much more important than she had ever anticipated. The confrontation, the engines hummed softly, and Maya couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled deep within her chest. She had done everything right. She had made sure to follow all the steps to ensure smooth travel. She had arrived early, she had checked in on time, and yet here she was on a flight that wasn't quite as ordinary as it should have been. Something was off, and the weight of it was pressing down on her shoulders. She looked around the cabin, observing the other passengers. A few of them had their heads down, eyes glued to their phones, while others stared out the window, perhaps lost in their own thoughts. But there was an unmistakable tension in the air, an unspoken understanding that something wasn't quite right. Maya's instincts as an aviation inspector kicked in. She had been in enough planes and airports to know when the atmosphere felt a little too heavy, when the smiles from staff seemed practiced too forced. She adjusted herself in her seat, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in the pit of her stomach. It wasn't just about the overbooking anymore. It wasn't just about her being bumped from her flight. It was about something more insidious. She had seen the way the gate agent had looked at her earlier, as if she was a problem that needed to be dealt with swiftly. Maya knew better than to let this slide. She knew how airlines operated. She knew how passengers like her were often treated as mere numbers in a system designed to squeeze as much profit as possible out of every available seat. Maya's eyes flickered to the flight attendants, who were walking down the aisle with a practiced nonchalance, but Maya could see the tightness in their shoulders, the hesitation in their steps. They weren't at ease. She could tell they were walking on eggshells. It wasn't just the routine check that Maya was used to seeing. It was the sense of urgency in their movements, the glance at the cockpit door, the quick exchange of looks between them. It wasn't long before the calm silence of the cabin was shattered by an unexpected announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the inconvenience." The captain's voice came through the intercom, and Maya's eyes snapped to attention. "We've encountered an issue with one of the passengers. We'll need to ask for their cooperation. We are currently resolving the matter." Maya's heart rate quickened, and her grip on the armrest tightened. She could feel the tension in the air shift from passive to active, from something uncomfortable to something dangerous. She looked around at the other passengers, who were now whispering among themselves, their eyes darting toward the front of the cabin. Their curiosity piqued, and their anxiety growing. Maya's mind was already racing, piecing together the fragments of the puzzle that were beginning to unfold in front of her. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden voice right beside her. "Maya Thompson." She turned her head to find one of the flight attendants standing in the aisle next to her. She was younger than the others, her blonde hair pulled back into a tight ponytail, and her uniform looked slightly too tight. her hands clenched as if she were trying to hide the nervous energy coursing through her. Maya looked at her, arching an eyebrow as she replied, "Yes, that's me. We need you to come with us." "Ma'am," the attendant said, her voice tinged with an urgency that made Maya's pulse spike. "The captain would like to speak with you in the galley." Maya's eyes narrowed, and she slowly stood up from her seat. She knew exactly what this was. She had seen enough of these types of situations to know when something wasn't right. The flight was far too tense, and now she was being called away for some discussion. This wasn't about a simple overbooking or seat reassignment. This was something far more serious. She followed the attendant down the aisle, every step measured and deliberate. Maya could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, their gaze flickering between curiosity and concern. But she didn't let it show. She didn't break her stride as she reached the galley, where the captain was already standing, waiting for her. "Maya Thompson," the captain said, his voice cold and formal as he looked at her. "Please come with me to the back of the plane. We need to speak about your seating situation." Maya didn't move right away. Instead, she studied him, sizing him up. His uniform was immaculate, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Something Maya couldn't quite put her finger on, something that made her believe this wasn't a simple case of overbooking. This was more than that. This was about power, control, and trying to intimidate someone who had the knowledge to call their bluff. "I'm not moving to the back of the plane," Maya said firmly, her voice carrying an authority that made the captain's eyes narrow in surprise. "If you have an issue, we can talk right here." The captain seemed to hesitate for a brief moment, as if weighing his options before finally speaking. "We have a situation here," he said, his tone still polite, but there was a noticeable edge to it. "I've been instructed to ask you to step off the plane and wait for another flight. It's not personal, but we have to make room for other passengers." Maya took a deep breath, trying to keep the anger from boiling over. She had expected this, but hearing it out loud still stung. "No," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of experience. "I've checked in properly, and I'm not volunteering to be removed from this flight. You cannot just push me off without cause." The captain blinked, his surprise evident, as if he wasn't expecting resistance. Maya knew this game. She had played it before. She had seen enough passengers get bullied, enough people treated like cattle, who were supposed to just go along with whatever the airline told them. She wasn't going to be one of them. The attendant standing beside the captain shifted nervously, but didn't say anything, her eyes darting between Maya and the captain, as if waiting for some kind of signal. "I'm an aviation inspector," Maya said, her voice steady and unwavering. "I know the rules and regulations better than most, and what you're doing right now is a violation of those rules. You can't just force people off a flight for no reason." "I'm not going anywhere." The captain's face hardened, and for a moment, there was silence between them as the weight of Maya's words sank in. It wasn't a threat, but a promise. She was not backing down. "You're making a mistake," the captain said quietly, his tone now laced with a bit of frustration. "You're making this harder than it has to be. You should just step off, and we can sort this out later." Maya took a step closer, her gaze unwavering as she looked him dead in the eye. "No," she repeated firmly, "I'm not going anywhere, and you need to start following the proper procedures. Because I'm not just any passenger on this flight. I'm a federal aviation inspector, and I'm fully aware of my rights." The tension in the galley thickened, and for a moment, no one spoke. The captain seemed to reconsider his stance, but Maya could see that he was trying to maintain control, trying to hold on to the situation despite the cracks that were showing her, making this very difficult. The captain muttered, his frustration evident, "Just come with me to the back, and we'll sort this out." Maya shook her head, her voice calm but resolute. "I'm staying right here," she said, "and I'm going to report this incident. I suggest you start making arrangements to compensate all passengers, including me, for the inconvenience." The captain looked at her one last time, his jaw tightening, before he turned and walked back towards the cockpit, leaving Maya standing in the galley with the flight attendant who still seemed unsure how to proceed. Maya felt the eyes of the passengers on her again, their gazes full of curiosity and silent support, but she wasn't concerned about them. She wasn't concerned about the staff or the captain. She was concerned about one thing and one thing only, making sure this didn't slip through the cracks, that the system didn't abuse passengers without anyone noticing it. She wasn't about to let that happen. Not today. The battle of wits. The cabin was eerily quiet after the captain's departure as Maya stood in the galley, her back straight and her mind racing. She could feel the weight of the entire flight's tension on her shoulders. Every eye in the cabin seemed to be on her now, but it wasn't the passengers she was worried about. It was the power dynamic at play. She knew how these situations worked. She had seen it too many times. The subtle manipulation, the forced compliance, the quiet pressure to back down, but Maya wasn't about to let that happen. She had a job to do, and it didn't stop at federal aviation regulations. It extended to making sure the people around her knew that their rights mattered. To the flight attendant remained rooted in place, her nervous energy palpable. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, as if waiting for instructions from someone who wasn't there. Maya could sense the fear in her eyes, the uncertainty of someone who didn't know what to do when faced with a passenger who wasn't going to be easily intimidated. Maya took a slow breath and turned to the attendant, her voice calm but firm. "I need you to understand something," she said, her gaze steady. "I'm not trying to make this difficult for you, but I'm not going to be coerced off this flight if there's a rule being broken. I will report it, and you can count on that." The attendant flinched slightly at her words, but nodded silently as if she didn't have the courage to respond. Maya could feel the divide between them, the clear separation of power and helplessness. She knew this wasn't her fault, but she also knew she was about to make waves. It was inevitable. The airline wouldn't back down easily. They never did, not without a fight, but Maya was prepared to fight back. Minutes passed in an uneasy silence before the captain reappeared, this time with two other crew members flanking him. One of them was an older man with graying hair and a stern expression that seemed to add to the already heavy atmosphere of the cabin. The other was a younger woman who looked just as uncomfortable as the attendant had earlier. Maya stood her ground, her eyes locked on the captain as he approached her with deliberate steps. "We've made arrangements for you to be reassigned to another seat," the captain said without preamble, his voice carrying the weight of authority. But Maya wasn't swayed. She wasn't about to let him dictate her fate without understanding what was happening behind the scenes. "I've already told you," Maya said, her tone unwavering. "I'm not moving from this seat." The older man beside the captain spoke up, his voice gruff and condescending. "Ma'am, we're trying to be reasonable here, but you're making this far more complicated than it needs to be." He paused as if waiting for Maya to back down, but when she didn't, he continued, "We can offer you a seat in business class for the inconvenience, but you need to leave your current seat immediately. We're running out of time." Maya could hear the thinly veiled threat in his words, the suggestion that she was somehow the one causing the delay, when in reality, it was their mismanagement that had put them in this situation. But instead of showing any sign of fear or hesitation, she stood taller, her gaze unyielding. "I'm not going to let you manipulate me into leaving my seat just because you didn't manage your booking properly," she said, her voice steady and strong. "I'm an aviation inspector, and I know how this works better than you think." The younger woman at the captain's side seemed to hesitate for a moment, her eyes darting between Maya and the older man as if waiting for a signal. Maya could see the fear in her eyes, but she also saw a flicker of something else. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was uncertainty. She couldn't quite place it, but the woman looked like she was on the verge of speaking out before she could. The older man interjected again, his voice laced with irritation. "You need to understand that this is above your head, ma'am," he said. "We are following instructions, and you are creating a scene that isn't necessary." His gaze hardened as he spoke, and Maya could tell he was growing frustrated with her refusal to comply. But she wasn't intimidated by his tone or his words. "Following instructions doesn't make those instructions right," Maya said quietly but firmly. "If you're going to stand here and tell me that I'm the one causing a scene for following the rules, then you're going to have to do a lot better than that." For a moment, there was silence. Maya could hear the faint sound of the engines humming in the background, but everything else seemed to freeze as the tension between her and the airline staff thickened. Maya's heartbeat was steady, but she could feel the adrenaline pumping through her veins. Her instincts were sharp, her mind focused. She wasn't going to let them get away with this. Not now. Not ever. Finally, the captain sighed, a defeated look on his face as he turned to the older man beside him. "We need to resolve this before it escalates further," he said, his voice lowering slightly. "Let's talk to ground control, and we'll figure this out from there." Maya raised an eyebrow as she looked at the captain, her voice still calm but with an underlying sharpness. "I'm not going anywhere until you fix this," she said, "and I'm not leaving this plane without getting the compensation I'm entitled to for your mistake." The older man scowled but didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned to the younger flight attendant and gestured for her to leave the galley as he muttered something to the captain. Maya could tell that the situation was far from over, but she wasn't going to make it easy for them. She had made it clear that she wasn't backing down, and she wasn't going to let them intimidate her into submission after a few moments. The captain turned back to her with a resigned expression. "We're calling ground control now, ma'am," he said, "but I hope you understand that we're doing everything we can to resolve this." Maya didn't respond immediately. She simply nodded, her eyes cold and calculating as she watched the exchange unfold before her. It was clear now that they were just stalling, trying to buy time, hoping she would give in. But Maya wasn't about to give them that satisfaction. She wasn't going to let this go until the entire issue was addressed and corrected. She had already seen how the airline was trying to manipulate the situation, and she wasn't going to let it slide. As the captain walked away, Maya took a deep breath and glanced around the cabin once more. The passengers were still watching, their eyes darting nervously between her and the crew. It wasn't just about the seat anymore. It was about standing up for what was right. It was about not letting the system continue to abuse people in silence. She knew that by the time this flight landed, things would be different for her and for the airline. But in that moment, Maya Thompson was more than just a passenger on a plane. She was the one who was going to make sure the rules were followed, no matter what it took. The revelation, the hum of the engine seemed louder now, almost as if the entire aircraft was holding its breath, waiting to see how this confrontation would end. Maya stood her ground in the galley, her eyes locked on the captain as he returned, flanked by a man in a dark suit who did not look like part of the flight crew. He had the calm, cold expression of someone who dealt with problems, not people. His presence alone confirmed to Maya that this had gone beyond a simple seating dispute. This was no longer just an airline issue, it was something bigger. The suited man introduced himself as Mr. Harris, from the airline's corporate security department. His voice was low and deliberate, every word weighed before it left his lips. "Miss Thompson, I understand there has been some difficulty with your seating arrangement. We would like to resolve this matter quietly and quickly." He spoke like someone used to closing deals behind closed doors, not in the middle of a crowded plane. But Maya heard the unspoken undertone. It was not a request, it was an attempt to wrap her situation in a neat package and tuck it away where no one could see it. She stepped closer, meeting his gaze squarely. "I am not here to make this easy for you, Mr. Harris. I am here to make sure your airline understands that you do not get to break the rules and expect passengers to accept it." Quietly, a flicker of irritation crossed his face, but he kept his composure. "I can assure you we have acted within our operational procedures." Maya almost laughed. "Operational procedures," she repeated, letting the words hang in the air, as if tasting their hollowness. "Those procedures are supposed to protect passengers, not be used against them. You overbooked, you targeted me for removal without cause, and now you are trying to hide it under your own internal policy." Passengers in nearby rows leaned slightly forward, pretending not to listen, but unable to ignore the scene unfolding in front of them. Maya could see their curiosity, their need for someone to push back against the faceless system that so often controlled their travel experiences. She had become that someone, and there was no turning back. Now Mr. Harris adjusted his tie, a subtle signal that her refusal to be intimidated was making him uncomfortable. "Miss Thompson, let us be reasonable. We can offer you an immediate rebooking, complimentary upgrades for future flights, and a travel credit." Maya did not move. She did not soften her voice. "No, I do not want your upgrades or your credits. I want an acknowledgement that what you are doing violates passenger rights and federal aviation law. I want a correction, not a cover-up." The captain, who had been silent until now, stepped in. "Ms. Thompson, with all due respect, we are on a tight schedule. Your refusal to cooperate is delaying departure." Maya turned to him, her eyes narrowing. "Departure will be delayed because your airline broke the rules, not because I refuse to quietly accept it. If you want this flight to leave on time, you should start by putting me back in my original seat and admitting your error." There was a long pause. A battle of wills fought in silence between Maya and the two men standing before her. Then Mr. Harris's voice dropped lower, his tone shifting from corporate diplomacy to something harder, more pointed. "Are you sure you want to go down this path, Ms. Thompson? Sometimes these things have consequences for both sides." It was meant to be a warning, a subtle threat designed to push her toward compliance. But Maya had heard worse in her career. She took one deliberate step closer until she was just inside his personal space. "Consequences work both ways, Mr. Harris, and I am not afraid of mine. Are you afraid of yours?" For the first time since he boarded the plane, Mr. Harris's composure faltered. His eyes flickered to the passengers who were now openly watching the exchange, then back to Maya. He stepped back slightly. The smallest indication that her resolve was making an impact. A voice came from somewhere behind them, a male passenger with a clear, ringing tone. "She is right. You cannot just throw someone off the plane because you overbooked." The comment was followed by murmurs of agreement from other passengers, and Maya felt a surge of quiet solidarity. Mr. Harris straightened again and turned to the captain. "I need to make a call," he said, before disappearing toward the front of the plane. The captain followed, leaving Maya standing in the galley with the nervous young attendant from earlier. Attendant hesitated before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. "You are not wrong, you know. I have seen them do this before. They count on people just taking the voucher and walking away. Most do because they do not want the trouble." Maya nodded quietly, her eyes still focused ahead. "That is exactly why they keep doing it." Moments later, the captain returned alone, his expression noticeably more controlled. "Ms. Thompson, we have been instructed to return you to your seat. The situation will be documented and you will receive a formal follow-up from corporate." Maya said nothing as she walked back down the aisle. The passengers' eyes followed her, some offering faint smiles or nods of encouragement. She sat down in 16B, buckled her seatbelt, and looked out the window. The reflection staring back at her was calm, but beneath that calm there was a fire. She was not done. This was only the first step, because now she knew this was not just about her seat. It was about a system that had been bending rules for far too long, and Maya Thompson was not the kind of woman who walked away once she had seen behind the curtain. The turning point, the aircraft was finally preparing for departure, yet the cabin did not feel like a place ready to take flight. There was a weight in the air, a quiet awareness that something unusual had just happened. Maya sat in her seat, eyes fixed on the aisle, as the crew moved about their final checks. They avoided looking at her too directly, their movements brisk and efficient, but with that underlying stiffness that came from knowing a situation had nearly slipped beyond their control. She could tell they were eager to push the moment into the past, but Maya was not ready to let it disappear into silence. Her phone buzzed in her jacket pocket, a message from a colleague at the Federal Aviation Administration. She had quickly typed out a brief summary of the incident. During the short lull after she had been returned to her seat, her colleague's response was short and sharp. "Keep documenting everything. This is bigger than you think." Those words lingered in her mind. The entire phrase carried an undertone that matched her instincts. This had never been about just an overbooked seat. There was something behind it, and she intended to find out. What the plane began taxiing to the runway, the vibration beneath her feet steady and rhythmic. Yet her mind was far from the mechanical precision of the aircraft's systems. She replayed the sequence of events, from the moment her name was called at the gate to the tense confrontation in the galley. Every look, every pause, every choice of wording by the staff, each piece of it felt deliberate and calculated, and if there was one thing Maya knew from her years as an inspector, it was that patterns rarely happened by accident. Young flight attendant who had first approached her earlier came down the aisle offering drinks, her expression neutral but her eyes still carrying that flicker of unease. When she reached Maya's row, she paused for a heartbeat longer than necessary, as if deciding whether to say something more. Then without a word she placed a bottle of water on Maya's tray table and moved on. Maya's instincts told her that silence was not from indifference but from fear. As the plane ascended, the captain's voice came over the intercom, delivering the standard welcome message, but there was a faint strain in his tone, as if his mind was elsewhere. Maya could almost sense the internal calculations happening behind the cockpit door. How much had been reported to corporate? How much had been left out? How much damage control would be waiting at the destination air? Hour into the flight, Maya decided she would not waste the time just sitting still. She pulled a small leather notebook from her bag and began writing. Every detail she remembered, the times, the words, the expressions, the passengers who had spoken up, and those who had been watching. Everything had to be recorded precisely. When dealing with cases like this, memory could be challenged, but written records were harder to erase. A man across the aisle leaned slightly toward her, speaking in a low voice. "I saw what they tried to do back there. It was wrong the way they handled it. They tried something similar with my wife last year. She was too tired to fight it." His words were not just casual conversation. They were a confirmation that this was not an isolated incident. It was a practice repeated quietly across flights and cities, relying on passengers being too polite, too weary, or too unsure of their rights to challenge it. Maya nodded and kept writing, but she made a mental note of him. If there was an investigation, he could be a witness still. She knew it would take more than a few accounts to make a dent in the shielded armor of a major airline. The quiet murmur of the cabin was interrupted when the older security man, Mr. Harris, reappeared, walking down the aisle with deliberate steps. He stopped beside Maya's seat, bending slightly to speak in a voice meant only for her. "I just want to make sure we're clear, Ms. Thompson. When we land, you will be met by a representative from corporate. They would like to speak to you privately about the matter." He kept his tone cordial, but there was still that trace of underlying force, as though this meeting was not optional. Maya closed her notebook and looked up at him. Her expression, giving nothing away. "That is fine. I will be happy to speak with them as long as I can also record the conversation and have my own representative present." That was enough to make him pause, his lips pressed together in a thin line before he straightened, and gave a short nod. "Very well." As he walked away, Maya could feel her pulse settle into a steady rhythm. Her confidence unshaken. She had dealt with enough boardroom suits and polished lawyers to know how to stand her ground. She was not just a name on a manifest. She was someone who understood exactly how far the rules stretched and where they broke, and she was more than willing to push them until the truth showed itself. The remainder of the flight passed in a deceptive calm, passengers returning to their books, their screens, their naps. But for Maya, the hum of the engines was the sound of preparation. She went over her notes again, refining details, making sure the timeline was airtight. She was ready to walk off this plane not as a weary traveler, but as a professional prepared to challenge a system that had been getting away with quiet infractions for far too long. She looked out the window as the clouds shifted below, the late afternoon sunlight streaking across the sky. Her reflection stared back at her, steady, unwavering, a reminder of why she was here, why she could not simply let this go. There was too much at stake for every passenger who did not have the knowledge or the will to stand where she now stood. And as the captain announced their descent, Maya felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders, because the real confrontation was not behind her in the galley. It was waiting at the arrival gate, where the airline thought they could contain her, but she had no intention of being contained. The descent was smooth, but the atmosphere in the cabin carried a quiet anticipation, as if everyone could feel that the story of this flight was not going to end with the wheels touching the runway. Maya kept her notebook closed, now resting her hands on it, as if guarding a sealed record. She glanced at the young flight attendant. Once more their eyes met briefly, and the smallest nod passed between them. It was not an alliance spoken in words, but it was a recognition, a silent agreement, that what had happened was wrong and should not be forgotten. When the wheels made contact with the runway and the plane rolled toward the gate, Maya felt a shift inside her. It was the subtle click of preparation, the readiness to step into the next battle. Her years as a Federal Aviation inspector had taught her that the moment after the incident was often more important than the moment during, because the follow-up was where truth could either be buried or brought into daylight, and she had no intention of letting this truth be buried. Seatbelt signs switched off, and passengers began to stand, stretching and reaching for their bags, but Maya remained seated, watching the aisle with calm patience. She could see two figures waiting just beyond the open door of the jet bridge. One was a woman in a tailored navy suit with the polished look of corporate PR. The other was a man in an airport security uniform. Maya could already read their intended roles: the woman to contain the damage, the man to enforce compliance. When her row cleared, Maya stood collecting her bag with unhurried precision. She stepped into the aisle and walked forward, her gaze fixed straight ahead. The suited woman stepped into her path with a professional smile. "Miss Thompson, my name is Rebecca Cole. I am the regional liaison for the airline. I understand there was some confusion earlier, and I would like to speak with you privately to resolve it." Maya's voice was calm but carried the kind of weight that made even corporate smoothness falter. "I am happy to speak with you, Ms. Cole, but only on record, and only in the presence of a representative from the Federal Aviation Administration. I have already documented the incident in detail, and I will be submitting a formal report as soon as I leave this airport." The security officer's eyes flickered between them, perhaps expecting the exchange to escalate. But Maya's composure was absolute. The passengers passing by slowed slightly, pretending to check their phones as they listened. The pressure of public eyes made Ms. Cole's smile strain at the edges. She gestured toward a nearby seating area, away from the flow of traffic, but still in plain sight, and Maya agreed to stand there rather than be led to some back office where words could be twisted. They spoke for nearly 20 minutes, Ms. Cole's tone beginning with carefully measured apologies and vague explanations about operational oversights, Before shifting toward an appeal for discretion, Maya never raised her voice, never lost her steady rhythm of facts and regulations. Each point delivered without hesitation. When Ms. Cole suggested that the airline could offer significant travel credits, as a gesture of goodwill, Maya's reply was simple and final. I am not here for compensation. I am here for accountability. The mention of a formal FAA report and the possibility of regulatory review shifted the power dynamic entirely. Ms. Cole no longer pushed for quick closure. Instead, she asked what the airline could provide in writing to acknowledge their breach of procedure. Maya stated her terms. Clearly the admission of error in a documented form, a commitment to review their overbooking practices, and a copy of the internal incident log for her records. Ms. Cole hesitated, but eventually agreed, aware that refusal would look far worse when the matter was inevitably investigated. As the meeting ended, Maya felt the weight in her chest ease slightly, but not because the problem was over, rather because she knew she had prevented this particular instance from vanishing into silence. She had forced it into the record, and that meant the first step toward change had been taken. Walking away from the gate, she heard footsteps and turned to find the young flight attendant from earlier, hurrying after her. Breathless but determined, she stopped in front of Maya and spoke quickly before losing courage. I just wanted to say thank you for not giving in. Most people just leave and it keeps happening. Maybe this will make them think twice. Maya offered a faint but genuine smile. It is going to take more than one incident to make them change, but this is how it starts, one person at a time, refusing to let them get away with it. They exchanged a brief handshake and then parted ways, Maya continuing toward the terminal exit, her phone already in hand as she prepared to call her FAA contact. The sunlight streaming through the airport windows felt sharper than when she had arrived, as if the air itself had shifted. By the time she stepped outside into the open air, she knew the fight was far from over, but she also knew she had won this round, not because she had stayed in her seat, but because she had refused to let the airline's authority overshadowed the truth. The sound of rolling suitcases and distant announcements blended into the background as she walked toward the taxi stand, her mind already focused on the report she would file tonight. For most passengers, the flight would be remembered as a minor delay, a small inconvenience in the blur of travel, but for Maya Thompson it would stand as proof that even in a system built to favor the powerful, a single voice with knowledge and resolve could hold the line and force change. She opened the door of a waiting taxi, slid inside and closed it firmly. The engine started, and the city began to move past the window, her reflection steady and unyielding in the glass. She was already thinking about the next case, the next flight, the next moment, when someone would need to stand their ground. This was not the end of her work, but it was the end of this battle, and in that quiet moment of forward motion, she allowed herself a breath of satisfaction, knowing she had done exactly what she was meant to do. The end